Hey there, my name is Jared, and this is the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. Are you curious about the world around you? You might just be a scientist in the making. In this episode, we're going to examine science. Welcome to the show. This episode is all about science. It seems that pretty much everyone has a foundation of how they view the world. Science seems to be a piece of that foundation. It is taught in every public school within the United States and around the world. The things we learn from science at such a young age tends to stay with us as we grow up. With its use of the scientific method and various other systems, science allows us to pick our world apart and begin to answer some of the big questions we went over in the last episode, such as, why are we here? What is our purpose here? And where are we going? I thought it appropriate that as society teaches us to use science to answer these questions, we too should start with science. In the first section, we'll start with the scientific method. What is it, and how can and how do we use it? In section 2, we'll see how the scientific method has shaped how we view this physical existence. And in the last section, we'll begin to get into what's called scientism. Before we begin, I'd like to ask, what do you remember from science class in school? Do you remember what the scientific method is? Here's a minute to think about it, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. Today we are talking about science. So what is science? Science actually means knowledge. It is derived from the Latin word scientia. By the late 14th century, the word science in English actually meant collective knowledge. Science as we have come to know it and think of it is really the use of the scientific method to examine and draw conclusions about the physical world around us. So, in that case, what is the scientific method? Well, the scientific method is a series of steps laid out in such a way as to allow us to examine the physical world, a series or pattern we all agree on that can help us, through experimentation, draw definitive conclusions. Having drawn those conclusions, anyone can look at the steps taken during any experiment, recreate the experiment, and expect to find the same outcome. Though we all agree that the scientific method can help us do that, there are many different models for the scientific method. Here we'll be going over the standard model of observation, question, hypothesis, prediction, experiment or testing, analysis, and conclusion. Let's look at each of the steps. Observation. First, we observe things around us. This is where curiosity comes in. Say we're looking at the stars one night, and we see a shooting star. Because it is so different than what we are used to seeing at night, it might make us wonder, what was that? This leads us to the second step, questioning the observation. Step 2, questions. So we saw a light flash in the sky and it made us wonder, what was that? Simple enough. But in science, it's always best to narrow down your question if at all possible. The more narrow the question, or more precise the question, the easier it is to get better results. But, as in our case, if you are just completely blown away and have never seen this weird thing like a ball of light shoot through the night sky, you go on what you know, or in this case, what you have seen. Step 3 is a hypothesis, or a guesstimate, if you will. I think that ball of light I saw shooting through the sky was my friend Bob riding on a magic carpet. I'm pretty sure that's what I saw, so I'll just go with that, and I'll go all over town and tell everyone that Bob has a magic carpet. But before I do that, let's make sure I'm right. A good way to do that is to predict when it will happen next, and to see if I'm right. Now, I saw it happen on a Friday night. That was my observation. And I know Bob pretty well. And on Friday nights, after he gets paid, I'm willing to bet that he gets all drunk up and flies around on his magic carpet. So I predict that next Friday he will do the same thing. This is step 4, prediction. Step 5 is where the proof has got to be in the pudding. This step involves testing our hypothesis and prediction, recording the test, and seeing if our prediction will come true. So on Friday, we trek out to the same spot, grab something that will allow us to see with a bit more clarity, like binoculars, and sit and wait. Turns out Bob never showed up, and our prediction never came true. Now we are really curious, and we start going out there every night to see if we can see the ball of light shoot through the sky again. Eventually, we do see it again, but it's not exactly in focus. The instrument that we are using, the binoculars, isn't powerful enough to get a good look at the ball of light, and so we keep at it. More experiments and testing, better equipment, tracking where each ball of light goes, until eventually, after years or perhaps decades, the ball of light lands in a nearby field, and we get a good look at it. And it's just a rock. It created quite a mess of the field, and it happened to be on old Bob's farm, but he was sleeping one off and didn't even notice. As we have gone through the years of testing or experimenting, using better and better equipment, eventually a specimen came to us. Once we found that specimen, we examined it, took samples, and ran more tests to see what it was made of. This is step 6, analysis. We analyzed the thing we found in the field and added up all the data we collected to get to step 7, our final step, a conclusion. We concluded that a rock from somewhere up there fell to the earth and landed on Bob's farm. Needless to say, his cows were not too happy about the whole thing, but it solved our question. What was that? That ball of light we saw shooting through the sky was a rock falling to earth. This conclusion obviously leads to many more questions, but it does solve our initial question. And so we have become scientists. More questions await, and more answers await. This method of examination has served humanity well over the past 700 or 800 years. Let's see how this has shaped our view of the earth and our existence. Before we go to break, here's a question for the curious. Where did the physical plane of existence come from? In other words, how did we get here? Perhaps you have an answer to this question. Maybe not. Think about it for a minute, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. The question of the origin of man has been a hotly debated, long-winded, mind-boggling conundrum for some. For others, it's been a question of faith. So who is right? Chances are, whoever you are, deep inside, you've already made a decision as to what you believe. I'm not here to change your mind one way or the other. This podcast, specifically this episode, is not designed to tell you what to think, but merely to remind you to think, especially if you've just accepted your view of the world or worldview, and how all this came to be, as merely some facts from a book, no matter what the name of that book. This subtle idea brings us to an interesting point. How has science changed our worldview? Or, put another way, how has science changed the collective knowledge and ways of seeking knowledge within our society? Before scientia, the Latin word for knowledge, became science, society's word for collective knowledge, there was religion. When we saw a shooting star, we would go to a priest or a rabbi or a soothsayer or shaman and ask them what we saw. These keepers of knowledge and wisdom would try to explain in what's called layman's terms or a simple dumbed-down version of what we had seen. Now, most of us rely on science as a means to explain the unexplainable. But it doesn't mean that science knows everything. But I tend to think that's the way most people feel about science. You know, it reminds me of a funny story about a conversation I had with a grade school teacher at a basketball game once. I was sitting in the stands of a youth basketball game with the mom of one of the student athletes when I struck up a conversation with one of the other parents. Somehow or another, we got on the subject of evolution. Now, I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and upon finding out that this parent was an elementary school teacher, I was very interested to find out what she was teaching her students. As the conversation progressed, things started to get a bit tense, though. The more questions I asked, the more she seemed to get flustered and indignant. It was actually much like a conversation with many professing Christians I've had, and I'm sure other people have. Her response, which to this day seems to draw a smile to my face, is very much in the same tone as many professing Christians when pushed to the limit of their own knowledge and understanding. Eventually, after enough questions, she responded with, "It's science!" as if she had answered everything with sheer volume and a seemingly all-encompassing word most of us think of when we hear the word science, as if just the word itself answered my question. Her response, after being asked those questions that she obviously could not answer, was much like a professing lukewarm Christian that hopes in something more than they believe or, better yet, know. Ask enough questions of this type of professing Christian, and you will inevitably get to the answer, you just gotta have faith, or we'll know everything when we get to heaven. I suppose it never occurs to either type of person to stop trying to be right or act like they know everything, and to just say what we all must admit from time to time. I don't know. What was interesting was the way that this woman handled being questioned about evolution, what she was teaching, and her personal beliefs on the subject. It seemed to boggle her mind that I questioned something she just assumed was fact, that of evolution. But as evolution is still just a theory, why should we not all question it? Again, this brings us to science and how it has influenced our worldview or our perception of the world around us. Long gone are the ideas of asking our priest or rabbi about how the world works. This idea brings me to another story about another conversation that was somewhat similar, but with different results. I was staying with a person I'm very close with, and her sister's boyfriend came to visit. We were left alone for quite some time, and eventually the conversation shifted to things a bit deeper than sports and weather. As we began talking about existence and the origin of man, it was obvious that I was talking to someone that preferred to keep their beliefs buried rather than to share them or perhaps even debate them. As the conversation progressed, though, he began to open up until we eventually reached an impasse. And his main point was, if he wanted to know how a car worked, he would ask a mechanic. If he wanted to know how the world worked, he would ask a scientist. And if he wanted to know how God worked, he would ask a priest or a pastor. But he knew quite a bit about cars, so he could fix it himself. And if not, he would call a mechanic. He felt like he had a firm grasp on how the world worked and didn't really need to know much more. So there was really no need for any scientists, until maybe medical questions, later on down the road or with friends or family. And as for questions about God, he was quite indifferent. God seemed to be something meant for other people, and as he put it, it's not really my thing. In this conversation, I was again interested as to how science, even though it really just means knowledge and the search for knowledge, was separated from religion, and not just religion, but the focal point of each religion, a supreme deity. It's interesting how these two things get separated, because it's estimated that 51% of the world believe in God, only 18% don't, and 17% are undecided. As we have seen so far, science is really just a term used to describe the collective knowledge of humanity. It only represents the seeking of knowledge. So, before we go to break, I'd like to ask, do you think God and science are at opposite ends of the spectrum? More on that when we come back. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. The question before the break, do you think God and science are at opposite ends of the spectrum? Has an interesting answer. In this episode, we're not trying to see if they go together. Rather, I think it's more interesting to see how they might have been ripped apart. As we have seen, science came to replace religion as the collective answer for everyday questions in life. Known as the scientific revolution, it's when the common people shrugged off or violently threw off the mantle and power held over them by religious authority. As we went through the scientific revolution in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, science started to replace religion instead of work with religion. There could only be one king over the people's thoughts and minds. Science would emerge as the ruler over the philosophy of the collective as we moved from revolution to enlightenment between the 17th and 18th centuries. Because of this paradigm shift, this change in philosophical ideas, people began to rely on science for answers instead of clergy, and rightfully so. As the religious leaders of the time had become too absorbed with power and had forgotten what knowledge was for, to share and to learn more. The problem with this replacement of the king, so to speak, was that the two were not to be in the same class. Only one could sit on the throne, and so God, and the idea of a supreme deity, was shut out of the advancement of human knowledge. All the way up until the present day, or almost. But those that seem to have these opposing views, God and science, seem to allow a cohesive coexistence. Just as the guy I talked to where he said if he wanted to know about a car, he would see a mechanic. If he wanted to know about the world, he would ask a scientist, and if he wanted to know about God, he would call a pastor. We seem to have compartmentalized things quite well. God is the unseen stuff that we can't explain until science, the thing that seems to be able to explain everything, until it can't. And then we go back to religion. And the deeper we go down the rabbit hole, bouncing back and forth between them, the more we feel like either I pick this search for answers as a career, or I leave it to the people who have and get on with going to work, paying bills, and living my life. I think most of this makes sense until we start to get into the realm of what's called scientism or theory. That's when things get a bit more blurry. Is it science that we are thinking of when we feel like we can explain big questions? Who are we? How did we get here? Where are we going? Then when we are challenged, we get flustered and answered with it's science. In this episode, we've gotten a good start on our journey with a look at what starts most people on a journey to answer any question. It's science. We have seen how science shapes our worldview. We have got a glimpse into how that perception influencer science decided not to include God as a variable into any equation. In the next episode, as we get into scientism, I think we will get a better understanding as to why. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If so, please feel free to hit the like button and subscribe for more. New episodes every Monday and Wednesday at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. If you did enjoy this episode, you know a friend that may be studying this or has some kind of interest, please feel free to share this podcast with them. Thank you for listening, and as always, and in all ways, may God bless you.